Hello everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to delve into the cognitive science about why unrealistic expectations are expensive. If you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like and follow us on Twitter, where we put out regular updates about our risk indicators and more. So I want to talk about this issue because I think it's one that's important and one that's really easy for people to inadvertently fall victim to this due to several different psychological factors and different ways in which kind of the crypto industry is currently structured that can promote these unrealistic expectations that can end up costing people money. So to start, what we're going to be talking about is obviously this idea of expectations. So to give a quick definition of what I mean, an expectation is just a belief that something will happen. And we form expectations about crypto all the time. For example, someone might form the expectation that some altcoin is going to 100x in the next 2 months. A lot of people form these kind of expectations, these kind of lofty expectations that crypto will make them a millionaire or even more, a multi-millionaire. Or people have specific expectations about their portfolio increasing by some multiple. Or, which I think kind of sums up the two different aspects I want to talk about today, this idea of not being satisfied unless you reach some high level of return. So there are two different new psychological principles or psychological factors I want to talk about that I think can kind of go together in the crypto space and ultimately make people end up losing money due to unrealistic expectations. So the first thing I want to talk about is numerical anchoring bias, which I think could be involved in leading people to form unrealistic expectations. And then I want to talk a little bit about how expectations impact our emotional responses to losses and gains, and how that can compound the problem even further. So numerical anchoring bias was a bias that was first identified by Tversky and Kahneman all the way back in the 70s. And the idea with anchoring bias is basically the idea that people, when they've encountered numbers in the environment or they've heard them, things like that, people will use them as a starting point. So you can imagine, let's say that someone heard about someone else who has a crypto portfolio that 15x'd recently. You know, they were able to grow their portfolio by 15 times. That 15, this 15x, would be what we'd call the anchor. It's this numerical value that acts as kind of the starting point from which we derive our own expectation of maybe what our portfolio might be able to perform or how it might be able to perform. So it's this number, the literal numerical anchor. That's what this is called. So the idea is that when people are then thinking for themselves, you know, what would I guess is a reasonable expectation for my portfolio going forward? The idea is that they'll use numbers that they've encountered as starting points. So for example, in this case, maybe I'd use this 15x as a starting point if I'm thinking what is a expectation I should have for my own crypto portfolio. Yeah, so the idea is, let's say I, for example, were to ask someone or ask you, will your portfolio 15x? Again, this 15x is what we call the anchor, the numerical anchor. It's the starting point. And then what Tversky and Kahneman argued is that people go through what they called an anchoring and adjustment process to then reach their estimate or their, in this case, expectation of what, in this case, a portfolio return could be. And the idea is that people will start with that 15x. They'll think, is that plausible? That if oftentimes, that might seem a little bit high. Maybe that seems like a bit of a high estimate. Say, okay, 15x might be a little unreasonable. Maybe it's a little bit too high. Maybe 13x is a little bit too high also, but 10x seems reasonable. That's the kind of adjustment that people do, is they move down from the anchor value until they hit something that they deem to be plausible. In this case, 10x. But the reason this is a bias is that it turns out that when people do this, when they've encountered a high anchor and then they try to adjust down to something that seems plausible, the estimate that they'll give, or in this case the expectation they'll form, is actually going to be biased towards the anchor. It's going to be higher than it would have been had they not seen an anchor. So for example, if the initial question had been something like this, by how many multiples will your portfolio increase? So I'm not giving any anchored number here, and there's no value, it's just an open-ended question. Then, this is giving kind of a low example, but this is generally what would happen, is that people will give a lower estimate than they would give had they seen the anchor value. So in this example, I'm giving, 10x versus 2x. in reality, these numbers are likely going to be different, and what is seen as a high anchor is going to be different for different people. But this is a general idea, is that anchors bias people's estimates, or in this case, their expectations, towards them. And so if we're seeing anchors that are really high in this context of, expectations of how much my portfolio will increase, the idea is that my expectation for my own portfolio of what I think is plausible will actually be biased upwards or higher than it would have been had I not seen those anchor values. So what's the problem here? Why is it the case that anchoring could be an issue here, that this could lead to unrealistic expectations? Well, I think the problem here is that in crypto, those numbers that you're encountering, those kind of stories you're hearing about returns in portfolios, tend to be pretty, let's be honest, unrealistic. People talk all the time about 50x returns, 100x gains, this idea of everything to the moon, crypto taking you to the moon, and kind of just anchoring people to this idea that getting 100x returns is just par for the course in crypto. And so if they're going to form their own expectations of how high their portfolio might go, then they'll start with 100x as their starting point, as that anchor. And even if they do adjust down to something like 50x or even 30x, let's be honest, at this point in time with crypto, with volatility shrinking, that's becoming quite a bit harder to achieve in these times. And frankly, throughout crypto, it's been hard because, for every person that's done that, there have been other people who've gotten wrecked. With altcoins, most altcoins tend to go to zero. And so, people who stuck with Bitcoin from the beginning will have realized these kind of profits, but there have been a lot of people along the way who, even in earlier days of crypto, would not have just been guaranteed to get a 100x profit. And so especially now, in my view, 100x gains are quite unrealistic. It's unrealistic to expect that that's going to be it. Even 50x, 30x, anything like that is going to be quite unrealistic. And the issue is that anchoring is going to be pushing people to forming those expectations as they're entering the market today. And then also, just companies in the space also feed into this. So with a lot of the exchanges, or the apps that exchanges have, using Coinbase as the example here, one of the ways that they structure their interface is that front and center, they'll put in the top movers, the coins that have moved up the most in the past day or so. And so it kind of, again, anchors you to expectations of what is going to be happening in a given day. This idea that, seeing 43% or higher, sometimes 100% moves in a single day for a coin, it just basically just gets those numbers in your head. And if you're thinking, what's a realistic expectation of how these coins move, you're going to be thinking about those ones that are just randomly moving like crazy, ignoring all the ones that aren't moving like that at all, or that are actually dropping. And so this is not, on the portfolio scale, this is day to day, but again, it's anchoring you to these high gain numbers. And so if your expectation is how much is crypto going to move, the idea is that it's going to be anchoring you in this direction, potentially. So that's one thing that feeds into this. Then also, obviously, you'll see a lot of people talk about the winners over the past year, for example, the coins that have really gone crazy and realized incredibly high upside. But then, of course, people don't talk about all the coins that went to zero, that absolutely failed, and that people lost a lot of money on. So again, people are anchoring to the success, anchoring to the highest possible values is what to expect from a given project of how it might appreciate in price over the coming year, for example. Whereas a lot of people then just don't see those really low values. So you're anchoring yourself to that excessively high value. And if you're going to form expectations of where your favorite project might go, maybe it's going to be biased upwards by these values that you've been seeing. And then finally, we just know that in crypto, one of the kind of unfortunate realities is there are a lot of what it's often called moon boys, these influencers who are just going out there all the time and talking about how a coin is going to go 100x, how your portfolio is going to 1000x, how you're going to be turned into a millionaire by this particular project. And obviously, people like to hear that because people like to believe that they're going to be a millionaire off of crypto. And these influencers really kind of feed off of that. But they just feed into this whole process of setting unrealistic expectations, of anchoring people to unrealistically high values of return. And so that's my argument for how I see numerical anchoring bias impacting people's expectations in cryptos. In my opinion, people form unrealistic expectations about their portfolio's performance. And now I want to explain a little bit about why I think that's a problem and how I think that can be costly to individuals. And so to do this, I want to take a step into a different literature that looks at expectations and how they influence emotional responses to outcomes. In this case, particularly gains versus losses. And so there's quite a bit of extensive research on this. And the overall findings from this research is that surprise tends to amplify emotional reactions to outcomes, in this case, losses or gains. So if I get an unexpected gain, that will feel a lot better. I'll be a lot happier than if I get an expected gain, for example. So let's say I buy a coin, it goes up 3x, but I expected that coin to not do much at all over those coming months. That will be a positive experience. Or let's say, for example, I buy a coin in a really bearish condition, expect everything to keep going down, but I've just bought it at the off chance that maybe something goes the other way, and then suddenly it goes up. That'll feel better than if everything's already going up. That's kind of the idea. But on the flip side, then, what that means is that if you expect losses or gains, then they're less emotionally impactful. So if I expected to gain a bunch of money on a token that I invested in, then once I get that gain, it doesn't really feel that special. It's like, okay, sure, I expected that. That's the idea, is that when something's unexpected, when it's surprising, that amplifies your emotional reaction. When it's expected, it's not surprising. It's not particularly impactful. You just kind of already have, in your mind prepared for that outcome. It's not especially pleasant for a gain or painful for a loss. Now, why does this matter? Why is this something that is important to continue to think about? Well, let's take an example here. So let's say that you expect a 10x profit in your portfolio and you actually get it. That pans out. Well, what we know from that research on expectations and emotional response is that once you achieve that 10x profit, it's not going to feel hyper pleasurable. It's going to be pleasurable, sure, you're going to feel happy, but it's not going to be especially happy. It's not going to really be bowling you over because it was expected. It was just like, yep, I thought that was going to happen, and it happened. And one of the things that could lead you astray is it might change how you respond to that gain. You get to the 10x and you say, but I want more. I want to feel happier. This isn't enough. Maybe you don't lock in any profits, and then market turns bearish and you lose it all, for example. This happens all the time in crypto, where people sit on massive unrealized gains, but then never cash out, never take profits, end up losing it all because they never did that. So that's one way that this can lead into that kind of a phenomenon where, again, it doesn't really feel that special if I expect it, so maybe I just don't react, and then I miss my opportunity to lock in that gain. So that's one way it can be a problem. The other reason it can be a problem, and I think this one is one that probably happens more often, is that people expect something like a 10x gain, which in a lot of circumstances it actually is oftentimes probably unrealistic, and then they don't get it. It never materializes, or maybe they're up even 50% or 3x, but it's not 10x, so they're not happy. So they get frustrated. People get annoyed. Why am I not achieving these kind of gains that I think I should be achieving, especially because I'm looking at all these influencers who are claiming that they're making outlandish profits, where in reality that's probably not actually the case. And that can just make people feel like they're missing out. They get frustrated. And what that can do, if people think that there's something more they need to do to achieve these profits that they think are reasonable, but in reality are probably unrealistic, is it might make people go further out on the risk curve. And the idea of the risk curve is basically this idea that the more risk you take, the more reward is possible, but it's not oftentimes a linear function. It's this idea that at a certain point, the amount of extra reward you could expect based on 1 unit of risk starts getting lower and lower and lower. And the idea is that in crypto, people might, if they have unrealistic expectations for their portfolio's performance, say, all right, Bitcoin and Ethereum aren't cutting it. I'm going to go even further out, or even, the kind of bigger, the top 50 aren't cutting it. I'm going to go down into the 500 or even further. I'm going to go into the dog coins and just basically gamble on these really microcap assets and hope they pump like crazy and bring things up, kind of really going out far out on the risk curve. And the issue with that is that we know with altcoins that a lot of them are just going to go to zero, right? We just know this for a fact. You look across altcoins, they're not like Bitcoin. Bitcoin trends up with time. A lot of altcoins don't, especially the kind of more crummy ones, and especially just the meme coins and the kind of the garbage tokens. Those, you can basically guarantee the vast majority of those are going to go to zero. And so then again, the problem is that if people go out on the risk curve and start getting into those coins and then miss their exits, or just simply get wrecked from the very beginning, you're just going to be losing more money. It's going to take you further and further away from that unrealistic expectation. You might get more and more frustrated, go into even more risky assets and lose even more money. And it can become a destructive process as a result. And so that's my argument about how unrealistic expectations can lead to these problems. Now, obviously, not everyone with unrealistic expectations is just going to go gamble in meme coins. But this is just to give a sense of what could happen based on those unrealistic expectations, as it can lead people to make decisions that aren't really the most wise, potentially. And that's why I'm arguing that unrealistic expectations are expensive. That when we go into investing and expect to become a millionaire overnight, if we expect to have these just crazy high multiple returns, and we might be basing that on what we've seen other people talk about, but then obviously they're oftentimes presenting a skewed perspective, and we're ignoring all the possibilities for losing money, it can lead to these issues. And so, obviously, I'm not providing financial advice. You should form your own idea about how to navigate the markets. But one of the things that I think about with this is that it might be best to plan for the worst, but hope for the best. And what I mean by that is form reasonable expectations. Don't think that you're going to become a millionaire from crypto, but do see it as the opportunity that, in my opinion, it is. And then from that, it should hopefully allow you to navigate the market in a more kind of cool, calm, and less emotional manner, where you're not expecting the moon, and so you're able to realize when you're up 3x on a coin, that's pretty darn good, for example, or things like that, where you're not going to be missing profits because you haven't hit your 100x target, which was probably never realistic to begin with. So just some things that I am thinking about from this cognitive science perspective about why these unrealistic expectations, how they form in the crypto landscape, and why they can be expensive. All right, if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter. And remember, with data-driven analysis, in my opinion, we're all going to make it.